Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
Welcome to the ITPro Podcast, your weekly guide to the most important topics in the IT industry. So we are recording this on the day before Brexit Day, so while there's no Brexit coverage in the podcast, we will have some analysis on the site that we'll be able to link to in our footnotes.
Are you looking forward to Brexit Day? Have you got your decorations up?
Yes. No. I was thinking about this earlier, and I was thinking actually kind of all the build-up and stuff. I think Brexit Day itself is far more meaningful to people who are very invested in Brexit than it is necessarily to people who are more on the Remain side. I know that there are some Remainers who are going full-on mourning, but that's not really me. You've got to get on with it. And now we need to look at the next phase, whether that's from a political point of view, but also from a business point of view. Fine, we're leaving. What does this mean in terms of regulatory alignment? What for our listeners does this mean in terms of data management and data transfer across borders? What does this mean in terms of getting infrastructure in? How much is your next server going to cost the next time you want to do a hardware refresh? Those are the important questions now.
So, with that cherry chat out the way, I think we should move on to our first story.
Okay, so our first story this week is that the United Nations has been hit by a possible state-sponsored cyber attack. Now, there were 3 sections that were affected, and while the story only came to light yesterday, the attacks themselves, they happened in the summer, July and August, but the document that... documents the fact that the attacks, which were on at least 40 servers in Vienna and Geneva, the document was dated 20th of September, but has only been leaked this week.
Unsurprisingly, fingers have been immediately pointed at potential state-sponsored actors. The attack was so sophisticated, according to UN sources speaking anonymously. The attack was so sophisticated that there is not even any trace of the post-attack cleanup operation.
So this was originally reported by the New Humanitarian, but Time also followed up on it, and somebody speaking to them said that maybe not on how sophisticated it is, because apparently the most skilled hackers, including the US, the Russians, the Chinese, they cover their tracks by editing the access logs, whereas with the UN networks, they were cleared. So it's clear that somebody has been in there because stuff is missing. So, I mean, to me, it seems likely that this would be a nation-state attack. What does the UN hold of any value to cyber criminals who aren't, doing ransomware? It's a get in, get out. So, I think that it's how sophisticated or not you want to put it, that, it's got to be a nation state, hasn't it?
I mean, as you say, a nation state is pretty much the only group that would have anything to gain by targeting the UN. It's not a defacement attack. It's not somebody point scoring or grandstanding by, attacking one of the most well-known supranational institutions in the world. It's somebody doing a kind of, as you say, a very quiet get in, get out operation, which is pretty much only going to be, as you mentioned, someone like Russia or, China.
I mean, I'm not going to sit here and point fingers because I don't have any of the evidence or anything like that. And I'm not an actual cybersecurity professional. However, this isn't the only attack on this kind of supranational organisation that there has been. Amnesty, of course, was targeted last year. So maybe there's a pattern emerging, maybe there's not, but that was thought to be a nation state as well.
It'll be interesting to see how the investigation develops and whether or not we get any more clarity into the potential perpetrators, but also the methods that were used to carry out the attack, because there has as yet been no firm indication on how they actually carried out the attack. So moving on, the UK government has finally come to a decision on what role Huawei will be allowed to play in the UK's 5G infrastructure after many, many, many months of delays and prevarications and essentially kicking the can down the road. I think this particular decision has outlasted at least 2 governments.
And that possibly says more of the state of politics in 2018, 2019 than it does anything else.
Well, quite.
Yeah, so Huawei has been granted a limited role in the UK's 5G infrastructure, but the company is going to be kept away from the core parts of the network, the critical networks, that kind of thing, and apparently will only be allowed to supply 35% of the hardware connecting devices and equipment to mobile phone masts. Now, it doesn't surprise me, this outcome at all.
No. I mean, fundamentally, the reason that Huawei is so prevalent in the 5G space, and it is basically the name when it comes to 5G, the reason for that is because their technology is miles ahead of any competitors. So locking them out of the network entirely is just not feasible. I mean, when all this Huawei brouhaha kicked off several years ago at this point, there was a report that removing Huawei from the UK's 5G infrastructure would set back 5G development by about 18 months.
Yeah, you'd have to rip out everything and start again, really. And yeah, like you say, it's that they did the whole 4.5G. They were one of the most honest, when I was covering networks, one of the most honest companies about 5G. They were one of the very few who wouldn't kind of try and bluff you talking about 5G. They'd be like, yeah, sure, 5G doesn't exist quite yet. We've got 4.5G, it's blah, we're hoping to get 5G whenever, which was really refreshing. I'm also not surprised because it's come out today that the EU is going to allow what are being deemed high-risk suppliers on 5G networks. What this means is that the EU isn't going to issue a blanket ban on these kinds of suppliers. So Huawei is the big name, but presumably other Chinese companies like ZTE are in there. But nation states are able to make their own decisions.
It should be noted as well that the US in particular is not happy with this decision. Yeah.
They are so upset. Lindsey Graham, the United States, or one of the senators in the United States, is very unhappy about this, has been on Twitter talking about how disappointed he is. And also, UK politicians as well, David Davis and Ian Duncan Smith, notably, are also very unhappy about this decision. But like I say, it's pragmatic as much as anything else. The call is coming from inside the house. They're here.
And over a 5G network.
Oh, no indeed. It's too late. And keep them away from core stuff, keep them away from critical infrastructure. I'm sure that was probably the plan and the case anyway.
Well, quite.
Yeah, it's nothing to get super upset about.
No, unless you are Lindsey Graham, apparently.
Yes.
And now in a slightly surprising but weirdly heartwarming bit of news, it turns out that UK developers are the most contented developers in the world, which is nice.
Yes, this is according to a survey by French coding platform Coding Game, based in Montpellier. They surveyed over 20,000 IT developers in 120 different countries. And yes, those in the UK, we are super, super happy. And on a scale of 1 to 10 about how happy devs are, apparently globally 66.4 said between 7 and 10, and the UK came up top with an average of 7.4.
I think this may be surprising to anyone that has dealt with UK developers for any extended period of time. They don't always immediately jump out as the cheeriest people, but the numbers don't lie. And apparently, the UK's developer community is the most contented with their jobs. But it should also be noted that one of the findings of the report was that YouTube is among the most popular learning tools.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
No, it doesn't hugely surprise me, but I think it is very interesting that it has become so kind of prevalent. I mean, use of traditional books on coding has fallen way down behind platforms like YouTube and things like Code Academy and stuff like that. But I think it's just nice to see.
Yeah, I mean, I know IT professionals. I don't actually think I know any coders. But yeah, I know other IT professionals who do use YouTube to look up how to do various things, something they might have done for the first time, or something that perhaps they're wondering if there's an easier way to do whatever. And people learn from people. It's sort of virtual tutoring or mentoring in the same way that you might have gone to somebody who, I don't know, say you're a carpenter, apprentice carpenter, and you might speak to a more practiced carpenter about stuff and they might show you how to do it. It's that, but over the internet. What I did like as well, what they found out is that Java and JavaScript are both the best loved and most hated coding languages.
I suspect probably by the same people a lot of the time. It's pretty much the circle of life when it comes to coding. JavaScript is great. This is amazing. Why don't I use this more often? 2 hours at it. Why won't you compile? But yes, it's again not hugely surprising either that JavaScript and Java are among the most popular languages. They're certainly kind of among the more flexible languages, most widely supported. There's heaps of resources out there for kind of both learning JavaScript and also kind of doing things with JavaScript. And it's still the one of the most widely used languages for Android app programming, which is...
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Google has directed Android developers to switch over to using Kotlin, which is a kind of programming language that Google has invested a lot in the development of. But for a long time, JavaScript was the go-to platform. And I think for a lot of devs, a lot of Android devs, it still is.
Well, we're going to take a quick break now, but when we come back, we'll be joined by Nigel Kersten, Puppet's Field CTO.
See you after the break.
For trustworthy help to live a financially secure life, make more money, and keep more of the money you make, follow the time-tested wealth-building strategies in Kiplinger's Personal Finance magazine. It's the magazine that started the entire field of personal finance journalism more than 60 years ago. Since then, Kiplinger's Personal Finance has helped millions of readers achieve financial security in any economic climate. New subscribers save 79% off the cover price. Visit store.kiplinger.com today. That's store.kiplinger.com.
Welcome back. We are now joined by Nigel Kersten, who is Puppet's Field CTO. And Nigel is going to talk us through the open source landscape as it currently stands. Because open source has been growing in popularity over the last couple of decades, really, to be honest. But tools like GitHub and the rise of cloud infrastructures and the rise of trends like DevOps in particular have had a huge impact on open source adoption. So, Nigel, from your perspective, what does the open source landscape in the UK look like at the moment?
So I moved over here recently, so it's only been a couple of months of living in the UK, but I've been working with a lot of our European and UK customers for quite a while. And I particularly tend to work with the really big enterprises, the banks, the people who are going through digital transformation. There's my air quotes going on at the moment. Fundamentally looking to change how they're doing stuff. And open source is everywhere. I think the long gone are the days where there was even a debate over whether companies should use it. Everything from their development libraries to the tools they use to the infrastructure management layers. Like everything, open source is all over the place. But I think one of the things, and maybe this is the slightly idealistic part of me, that gets a little dismayed, I think, at the wasted social opportunity of most of the relationship large companies have with enterprise tends to be commercial. They tend to be paying companies like myself, who literally pays my, allows me to feed my children and to eat each day, money for commercial distributions of open source software or for support in that software. And the actual sort of contribution back in other ways doesn't really happen. And I think this is one of the really sort of big missed opportunities of our time and it doesn't have to just be code. I think I'm seeing over and over again lots of companies essentially not reinventing the wheel, because I think lots of people are defining new processes for new capabilities, but they're all doing it in isolation. And these things aren't competitive advantages at all. And it just feels wasted. And maybe this is, 14-year-old communist Nigel getting a little upset at the lack of, shared social endeavor. But there's no huge advantage in having a slightly different approach to regulatory processes when you've got a much more automated system.
Yeah, and I mean, I remember when I was first talking to people about open source or asking people about open source, and the idea of recontributing to the community is supposed to be sort of a cornerstone of what open source is all about, isn't it?
It is. And I think, I've been involved with Puppet as an open source project now for 13 and a half years, I think, when I first deployed it at Google. So I was sort of part of the open source community, contributed lots of code, and then eventually went to work for the company trying to make a living for a bunch of people out of it. And I think there's a few myths around open source. One is that you end up with most of your users contributing code back. And that might be true for developer tools, it might be true for developer libraries, but there's an awful lot more open source where there's a very small group of people who are maintainers and a much larger group of active users. And those users can be contributors in all sorts of ways. But I think if you've never been an open source maintainer, it's a really difficult job. People are quite demanding, they have sort of commercial expectations of you. And I'm not talking about our product, I'm talking about the hobbyist contributor. I think we saw recently, someone laid into a Rust developer who had one of the more popular web servers and had so much vitriol and hatred spewed in his direction that he just went, forget it, this isn't worth it anymore, and deleted the whole repository.
Oof. But I mean, that's the thing, in a lot of cases with open source projects, it's people who are, giving up their time for free. Going back to the story we talked about just before the break, 1 in 3 developers spends at least an hour a day coding in their spare time to, either to keep their skills sharp or, just because they want to. But a lot of that effort goes back into open source projects. Again, unpaid, in their own time. It's not just these huge tech companies like Google and Microsoft and whatnot who are putting the work in to keep these repositories and these projects maintained. It's ordinary working devs.
Yeah, that's true. But I would also say that I think for most of the most widely used open source projects, some commercial company somewhere is paying the bill for someone. Like even if you look at something like the Linux kernel, all of the folks who are actually core contributors get it employed by someone else. And it may not be directly related to that company's, direct revenue goals, but someone's paying their bills. I think the sort of free software, and I think this is an interesting thing as someone who's been around a while, that we no longer really even have the debate about free software versus open source anymore. The free software vision of developers all over the world contributing to a gradually rising tide of software quality just hasn't really happened, as far as I can tell.
I mean, playing devil's advocate for a moment, though, what's in it for the big boys if they are using open source? What is the benefit for them to contribute back other than altruism?
Oh, I think there's a huge benefit. And I think one of the things that you've got to take a broader view of contribution. It has to be more than just the core code. And I think, just contributing good bug reports, the number of times I talk to companies where they're like, oh, we know about this bug that exhibits at scale at this version, and we just don't use it that way anymore. And there's all these but I think before I make companies sound stupid, and I think there's something to be said for the idea that once you get enough people together, they become dumber. I think there are huge institutional barriers to this. Like changing the mindset from we must protect all IP that is possibly generated within our organization and it's all could be valuable one day, to a mindset of, well, we can actually spend time bug reporting and this is valuable to us. Is a huge shift, but it's also really difficult, I think, for the practitioners on the ground to go, well, what's a safe bug report? How am I going to describe what's happening within my organization externally in a way that doesn't cause me to lose my job?
I think part of it comes down to a lack of person-to-person communication. Like, for example, the dev community is quite good through things like, meetups and conferences and whatnot are quite good at information sharing with their peers in other organizations. But I would argue that you lose quite a lot of that when you get up to the kind of senior levels. You don't get nearly as much, operational collaboration and knowledge sharing when you get to senior IT manager or, CIO or CTO or whatever. A lot of that tends to die off. I think part of it is, as you mentioned, the kind of the not wanting to give away too much of your own internal workings, whether that's to maintain a supposed competitive advantage or to keep up operational security, the whole security through obscurity thing, which is a whole other kettle of ball games.
I think part of this too is as you rise in seniority through a company, and I don't exclude myself from this, part of your job is representing the company. You're no longer just a practitioner using tech in an interesting way that you can talk about. Part of your job is the PR. Part of your job is representing the company. And as you get higher and higher, I think this is why people tend to not share information in public, and why even as much as you look at what DevOps Enterprise Summit and a lot of these summits where senior leaders are supposed to be about sharing their failures and learning from each other. Everyone is putting a huge PR spin on it.
Oh, of course.
Every single tech conference in the world, every thought leader piece, everything I have written has some sort of worry where I'm like, well, I don't really want to show my company in a particularly negative light, and I'm not going to air all the dirty laundry.
No, of course. But then I think there's a lot to be said for the argument that if more people, more companies are willing to own up to their security failures or, their mistakes when rolling out a new project or when deploying a new application version, because, these things happen. Microsoft, as we covered on the podcast last week, Microsoft had a misconfigured server which led to 250 million customer records going missing. So it does happen to everyone, and the more people talk about it, the more people are willing to put their hands up and go, yeah, we may have made a mistake. The more the community at large can learn and kind of get better at those kind of things.
I absolutely agree. And before I put this all on companies sounding stupid and open source maintainers and vendors generally being paragons of virtue, I think we haven't made it particularly easy for new contributors to always contribute to open source projects. I think there's that sort of geek cred, people like to argue on the internet. Not everyone has that sort of confrontational, rather sort of macho style that I think the Linux kernel mailing list exhibited for an awfully long time. And so I think this is something I think about a lot. I've always felt like we have a pretty good nurturing community inside Puppet. And I see a lot of other vendors try and do exactly the same thing. And that feels really, really important. Give smaller voices a space to open up about their mistakes, and that actually leads to better documentation for more people, more diverse viewpoints. We know all of these things are good, but I think there's got to be something else none of us have really nailed about how do we convince large companies to make it easier for their individuals to contribute back? Because you said, 1 in 3 developers write code in their spare time, which I actually think is actually probably a little high. There's probably 1 in 3 developers who care enough to answer an online survey write code in their spare time. I would argue that 90% of developers out there are really happy with their 9-to-5 job. They have a great pension plan. Their job's fine. They go home and they have a life that is not writing code all the time. And I think that's great. More people should have a better life balance like that. But how do we get at those people who are using open source stuff, lower the friction for them to contribute, help remove the institutional barriers, make it easier on the open source project side to accept stuff. This is, I think, difficult work. And this is why I think the rise of developer relations and community management has been so huge over the last few years.
So thinking about IT professionals who might like to bring open source into their company, who then for whatever reason they're not using it at the moment, one of the arguments that I've heard is that because the code is just out there, it's not secure. The bad guys could get hold of it and be like, haha, and be nefarious with a moustache twiddling type way. How can these IT professionals put the argument to those further up the chain that actually you should be using open source, that it is beneficial?
So this is going to sound incredibly self-serving, but I think this is legitimately why I have a business that I work at. I think this is where the open core model does actually work, where you have an open source distribution of stuff, and then you have a company selling commercial versions of that or selling support contracts for it that they make promises around. And something I definitely noticed is as we started to be adopted by more and more traditional enterprise companies, they started to demand certain things in their service contracts, where they're like, do you have a security scanner running, checking for malware before you package up your software? What is your process for repairing defects? What is your process for assigning CVSS scores and repairing them? I think all of these things that in some ways can feel a little like bureaucracy are that sort of safety net and build trust. So I wouldn't suggest that if you're at a company that doesn't do open source at all, that you would then go, you know what I should do is I should start git checkout from GitHub and start deploying that across my infrastructure without any permission from anyone. Because your manager's probably going to get rather upset. There's sort of intermediates. You know, Red Hat provides support for a bunch of their things. I mean, IBM now.
Well, yeah, the magic phrase there, Red Hat. Acquired by one of the biggest, most legacy vendors. What impact has that had on the open source community? Because I know there was a bit of up in arms at first. Things have died down a bit. How is the outlook now?
I think it's going to be interesting to see, as I think there's going to be a cycle time before the reaction really hits, because I think even Red Hat is very long support contracts. I think, as a software vendor who has to support stuff on top of Red Hat, the fact they kept extending their 10-year support contracts for RHEL 4 further and further along to their biggest customers who would then demand the same thing from us was rather painful. So I think it's going to take a little while before we actually see the impact of that. I think the other really big interesting one, as someone who is like a veteran of the OS, of the Microsoft, Apple, Linux wars of the 90s, is the huge pivot in perception that we've seen around Microsoft. The fact that, they've acquired GitHub, it's been relatively low drama. The fact that they seem to have legitimately built one of the best open source editors out there with Visual Studio Code that we now build upon, that they appear to be poking around looking at acquiring all sorts of other open source companies. And no one is up in arms. People are like, you know what? They feel like quite a good home for this stuff.
Literally. I mean, who would have thought, say, 5-10 years ago, that Linux or open source companies would be actively courting Microsoft for acquisition? It feels mental.
Well, I remember even when Apple moved to OS X and OS X is Unix based, and everyone was like, this is a scandal.
We want single preemptive multitasking where if I hold down the mouse button, the clock stops ticking.
Yeah, I look back on it now and I'm just like, did that really happen, or am I no, yeah, it did.
Oh, it was huge, because I was a Mac/Linux person back then, and was quite involved with Next Step and doing web objects development, and so for me it was just like, oh, thank God we've merged all of these different platforms together. But yeah, the fact that Microsoft in many ways seem to be doing a better job of keeping up with new open source components than Apple are is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it really feels like Microsoft has properly got back to its roots in terms of its kind of ethos.
Or maybe the battle's just shifted, and they're salting the ground behind them is another way of looking at it. And that's not quite fair. But I think the shift to SaaS, and I think this is one of the other bits of the open source landscape that's worth talking about, is that how much does an OS matter these days compared to the revenue you get from running services in the cloud? And I think this is the other big shift that I've found really interesting with open source, that we would, as a commercial vendor who followed open core, you would get the sort of more free software side of the equation folks going, you're not being ethically pure for selling a version of your software or for even keeping features back from the open source, but then happily using SaaS that was not at all open source. GitHub may be using Git, which is itself open source, but the whole GitHub stack is not.
Yeah.
Which is great, by the way. I don't want to say that that's a bad thing.
No,
I just think there's a certain inconsistency in criticism.
Yeah. And I mean, when I first came across Puppet was when I was working more on CloudPro, one of our sister titles, than I was on ITPro. So, yeah, I think the two do they do go hand in hand, and the growth of open source does seem to, they kind of fire each other? Is that the right word? Fire each other up? I don't know. Feed off each other? One of those
fuel
things.
each other?
Fuel each other.
There we go.
That's why you're a journalist.
The thing that I do think is definitely a mistake is the tweaking of open source licenses to try and stop the big cloud providers from taking your stuff and using it. As I think it indicates that if you've just got a business model around open source that doesn't have a strong enough community to defend you from that, you haven't really been doing open source properly. You've just been doing freemium in some kind of way.
I think the key thing to bear in mind is there are very few organizations that won't be using some elements of open source, whether they know it or not. I mean, point me to one dev team that isn't using at least one open source tool somewhere, even if that's just, GitHub.
And I think the thing that most clearly demonstrates that, if you look at folks like SNCC, who just got a huge round of funding, who have headquarters here in London, around open source components. If you look at, other companies like Sonotype, if you look at the various companies that this huge business that's exploded in the auditing and control of open source components in your application stack, I think just demonstrates how many people are using them. And I think maybe the biggest sign of success for open source is that open source components are becoming legacy inside large applications at large enterprises, just like the commercial software. It's that pervasive. The number of people who still have security vulnerabilities around some ancient version of an HTTP web server embedded within their application is innumerable.
So what happens next?
What does happen next? I think we're going to see generational change. Literally, people are aging out of roles. And as we see people who've grown up with open source move into governance, legal, managerial, senior executive roles inside large enterprises, am quite optimistic that some of these institutional barriers and cultural barriers to contributing outwards are going to change. I do think also that just open source vendors like us are going to have to keep working on how do we lower those barriers ourselves to make it easier for people to contribute. That all sounds rather optimistic, but I think if it doesn't happen, open source is going to get more and more expensive in a dollar sense for enterprises to adopt. And at some point, someone will come along with an economic rationalist argument and work out how to take advantage of the arbitrage there.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Nigel, thank you so much for coming in. It's been a fascinating chat, as always.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes and even more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk.
You can follow us on Twitter at ITPro, as well as Facebook and LinkedIn. And you can also subscribe to the ITPro newsletter. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email podcast@itpro.co.uk.
You can also sign up to receive the new ITPro 2020 magazine, which is a roundup of all the most important news and features from the month at our website. And don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find your podcast to never miss an episode. And we'll be back next week with more news and analysis from the world of IT. Until then, goodbye.
Bye.